wrong way.
Hello there, everybody. It is time for Dr. Laura Berman and me to talk to you about... we've got playback. Oh, no.
Wait, hold on. I'm going to turn this volume all the way down, and then it'll work.
Okay.
Okay, try again.
We're going to talk today about sexual healing, because today our sexual healing course launches. So we wanted to introduce you to this course, why we did it, and also answer some of your questions that you've got, so that after this you can go over to my page and get yourself the course if you're interested. So Laura, why don't you kick it off? Okay.
Hold on. I'm getting settled here, girl. Wait a second. Hi. So what do you want me to take away now?
Well, I think it should be interesting for people to know
why we're doing here.
Yeah, why are we doing this?
All right. So everyone on your page obviously knows you. I don't know if they know me, although they probably have seen me around your page because we've been friends. I don't know how many years, but for a while now. And we have been talking for so many years because I'm a sex therapist. And I deal so much with sexual trauma, and you and I have been friends for a long time and have spent so much time talking about this that we decided to join forces and create a course that we would really want to have to heal. Because both of us are victims of sexual trauma. And as we talk about often, pretty much everyone is on one end of the continuum or the other. And there aren't really a lot of good resources out there for people who are struggling, whether it's a Me Too moment, recovered memories, struggling with the impact of sexual abuse or trauma. And, I think that so often and we've talked about this, how people are told, you just need to get over it, or you're either going to be, if you were abused, you're either going to be a total slut or a total celibate. And the resources that are out there, sure, sex therapy works to an extent, but there are so many levels to it. And that's what was so exciting for me to work with you, because we could bring in the metaphysical and the spiritual pieces that I believe in so wholeheartedly in my work, but not a lot of therapists work with in my field.
Yep. So that's why we did this course, you guys.
Yeah. And it's coming out today, which I'm so excited about, that it launches today. And we spent 3 days together, right, in Park City. And that was intense, right? We were shooting for like 13 hours a day. We took two beautiful souls through the process of sexual healing. From start to finish, really. And then the people that get the course get to go through it with them and with us, which I think is so cool.
Yes, me too. So what can people expect from this course, do you think?
Why are you making me say all of this? You're like interviewing me about our course. Okay. All right. So what can they expect?
I'm feeling lazy.
Yeah, all right. Fine. I'll do the work. No. All right. What can they expect? I think what's amazing is that we take these two beautiful women, Sylvia and Corinna, who both are victims of sexual abuse earlier in life and different kinds. We share our stories of sexual trauma. We talk about all the different ways that it affects your life, your sex life, what happens when you try to come clean. We take people through the process of not only acknowledging what happens, but really going into the feelings so that they can be honored and released. And for so many, and we talk about all the different symptoms that come up from a sexual abuse history, like, the most common one being disassociation, right? Where you leave your body. And then even years later, when you're with a really trusted partner, assuming you can even tolerate having a partner, it's hard to have pleasure. It's hard to enjoy because you're not really in your body. We talk about how to actually have, or sometimes you really shouldn't have, a relationship with those people who did the abusing or enabled the abusers. What else, Teal, do we talk about on the course? Now it's your turn.
Oh. I've been, you know what's, do you want me to have an authenticity moment?
Yeah, of course.
It's been such a long time since I actually filmed this thing that I don't remember what
I know.
the chapters are.
I was thinking that today too. Okay. So I remember we took, cause it's been a long time, right? We did this like in April of last year.
We did. So
spring.
We started out talking about what trauma is. I can do that really quickly. I think that'd be totally beneficial to people.
That's why you were interviewing me, because you didn't remember. I was like, why is she interviewing me? All right, go ahead.
Well, it's like you know, this whole conversation around trauma is so huge and multifaceted. It's like what we basically did was to break it down into all these different chapters, so that people can figure out exactly how to go into a space of healing, which is to experience the opposite. By the way, if any of you are interested in what healing is, it's just to experience the opposite. So if you've gone from a place of feeling unsafe in relationships, healing is becoming safe in relationships. And that's a multi-chapter thing. So if I'm right, we started off talking about trauma. Mm-hmm. The definition of trauma, right, is basically distress without resolve. And so what people are really asking when they're wanting to overcome sexual trauma is, how do I create that resolve?
Right.
And that's something that I feel like is highly misunderstood. Like the way to go about doing that is highly misunderstood in society, especially because in the spiritual field, we tend to live in this atmosphere of you just choose to forgive.
Right.
Which I think is total BS. I think that forgiveness is the last step, not the first.
I think that's totally true.
Yeah.
And we tend to, we also talked about, we shared our own stories, right? So I'm kind of on one end of the continuum, and you, as most people know, are on the opposite end, and people are everywhere in between. And it could be anything from, just those times that your sexual boundaries weren't respected, or the fact that 1 in 5 women in this country, while their first sexual experience wasn't forced, it wasn't really wanted. It was done out of obligation, or because they really didn't feel like they had a choice, but they weren't really forced, to being sexually objectified, to being overexposed to sexual content like I was at such an early age, all the way to being a sex slave, or ritualistically and sexually abused. And, and the degree of the abuse does play a role in the intensity of the healing, but the healing is the same for everyone. And I think what we're told is to just get over it, or to just shut it down, or to live with the shame and just kind of push it to the side and pretend it's not a big deal, or just to assume that our sex life, that we're screwed in the sex life department, no pun intended, but like we're just never going to have good sex. And that's not true either.
Yeah. Reclaiming sexuality is a big piece of this, actually. So my team just threw me a big solid here, and they gave me a breakdown of the lessons so we can jog our memory. Ready?
Oh, good. Okay, go ahead.
Lesson 1, what is sexual trauma anyway? You kind of brushed on the surface of that. Lesson 2, it's about the story part, right? Lesson 3, why did this happen to me? So it's about a lot of those stories that we tell ourselves relative to sexual trauma, and a lot of the stories that, quite honestly, society reinforces.
Yeah. And that, let me just pause there for a minute, because that to me is one of the hugest things that like a big milestone in the work that I do with trauma victims, because it is astounding to me the depth and breadth of shame and self-blame that we carry, not only when we are victims of sexual trauma or abuse, but because it felt good, and it does feel good a lot of the time. Most of the time it feels, and there's all these conflicting. So if it felt good, then it was really my fault. Well, because that person gave me candy every time afterwards, and I was 6 years old and I wanted the candy, then that means I asked for it because I went back for more candy. So, that was the theme of that one is about how to really put the blame where it deserves.
Yes. We've also got a lesson on shame and guilt here. Yes. So right in line with that, we've got fragmentation. Fragmentation and being stuck in the past due to unresolved trauma. Oh, that's my favorite section.
I know you love that. You've done a lot of fragmentation work with me, and I'm the first one to announce, not only are you one of my besties, but you're also one of my most important teachers and healers. And I talk very openly about the sexual trauma you've helped me heal for. And I was a fragmenter, which we all are, obviously, but you really, I know I still have a lot of them out there. How many do I have now? You'll have to tell me. Is it?
Yeah.
But I brought back a lot of them. And that's really, really powerful work that I've been able to incorporate with my people too, which is so amazing. And it's not that is something that most people are not exposed to in traditional therapy or sex therapy or therapy for sexual trauma work, or those pieces of ourselves that we almost, will you talk about that? Like the pieces of ourselves that we leave behind and the way in which that cuts us off from ourselves?
Yeah, so I mean, it's the first thing to understand. I gotta solve this. Do you want me to go into that, or just talk about all of them and then go back to it?
Okay, put a pin in that. We'll come back. I think it's so important.
It is important. So put a pin in it, and we'll come back to it. So we're also going to be talking about gaslighting. Yeah. We talked about boundaries and healthy boundaries, which is one of the most poorly misunderstood thing in society. We've got rehabilitating your relationship to people, right? Because one of the big things that people fall into in terms of a trap is thinking that it's possible to be wounded interpersonally, which is what sexual trauma is. It's interpersonal trauma, without that being healed within the context of relationship.
Yeah.
And so it's about how to do that.
Just heal that and not either not ever see that person again, which is sometimes necessary, although still you're in relationship with them to a certain degree, whether you see them or not. But it also is about being in relationship with other people through the triggers. Yes.
And then we've got how to reconnect to your sexuality. That's probably your favorite one, right?
I love that one.
Yeah. And then we've got heal, learn, and teach, forgiveness and sharing your story.
Yeah.
Then we've got another lesson that we did on grief, which is important because that's something that I think, like what you brought up in the beginning, the attitude around sex abuse is just get over it, which is not possible, you guys. And then lesson 12 is moving on. So,
yeah. And that grief one that we did, I remember that was deep because we were, you have to remember that we're taking these two women through each of these in vivo. So you get to watch us work with them. You're learning, we're talking to you, we're talking to the women, but you got to see them and you took them through the most intense and beautiful process of really getting to the grief. And it was so beautiful the way you were able to demonstrate peeling those layers away of denial so that we could really, really get to it.
Yeah, I wish that society would transition into a society that doesn't trivialize sexual trauma.
And I think we're going to have to, because it's just coming out of the woodwork now, because not only are people finally coming forward with their Me Too stories, right? But as those at home are watching the news or seeing these other people come forward, they're getting their own memories triggered, or maybe they always remembered, but they just kind of have been pushing it aside. And now it's really coming to the fore. And maybe that's just something that's supposed to happen as we approach 2020, that's sort of in the ether for us to clear, especially, not only for men, but for women, especially, so that, because it really is a blockage to the divine feminine fully expressing herself. And we really need that right now.
Yes, we do. Yeah, we do. I worry with the Me Too movement about that too.
What do you worry about?
Well, I'm a little bit torn. I'm happy that women are coming forward with their stories, but I noticed this pendulum swing happen, which is going to get us into trouble as well. Yeah. Which is the pendulum swing is, well, I'm going to go ahead and call it rape, even though it's just the fact that I had poor boundaries.
Yeah.
And then men get pigeonholed into this position where they go out of alignment, which makes us go even more out of alignment. So I would like to avoid that one if we can here in society.
Yeah, it seems like every time we sort of swing the pendulum so far, I'm seeing that as the mom of 3 boys.
Oh my gosh.
Like walk around like this, scared to say anything because they're going to be called a sexist or a misogynist or, a belittler of women. And so I think that has to happen in order for it to come back to center. But I agree. There's going to be some backlash.
Yeah, hugely. So let's jump backwards to fragmentation, shall we? Okay, it's an underlying assumption that we make because when we meet somebody, they have one body, that's a unified being. So when I refer to Teal Swan or Laura Berman, I'm talking about a singularity. This is not the reality of how psychology works. It's not the reality of how consciousness works. Consciousness fragments, and that's actually the primary coping mechanism for a physical human. And it's important to understand coping mechanism. A coping mechanism by definition is something that we do to be able to put up with something. So it is an oppositional force to change. We only cope with something when we have already acknowledged we're powerless to changing it. So you got to take a look at that in and of itself. That may have been true at one point. Is it still true? What's happening at the moment of trauma is almost like we're creating a skipping CD. If there's no resolution with whatever happened in that moment, and what I mean by resolution is there was no way to make what happened add to your life experience, then it becomes stuck. It's like in that moment, our psyche splits and a part of us stays at the moment of trauma. This is the reason why we have triggers. And a flashback is a visual trigger, but what we're referring to as a trigger is nothing more than an emotional flashback.
Right.
And what it's doing, in fact, is calling our attention to that moment. So it's really tempting when you've got post-traumatic stress disorder to think that that's your body working against you, but actually it's working for you. It's desperately trying to get your attention back to what was unresolved.
Deal with me. Yeah. So that could be smells, that could be sounds, that could be certain sexual acts, that could be certain sexual scenarios, that could just be someone speaking to you a certain way. And you have this either huge reaction to it that doesn't fit the scenario, or you literally go back into physically, sometimes even into the trauma. And what you're saying is, that is a big sign that, people think, oh, I just need to keep pushing that away because I just need to push against that because I don't want that to happen. And the truth is that what you resist persists. And so what we're teaching people in this course is how to go into that moment.
Yeah, which is the opposite of what everyone teaches. So it's very important for people to get that about this course and what defines it from other courses. Yes. That the majority of people who are trying to deal with sexual trauma or any type of trauma are trying to make it so you don't feel triggered.
Yes.
That is not what we're here for.
No, we're taking you all the way into the trigger so that it no longer controls you and you can have resolution to, and you touched on something that I think is really important that we talk about in the Heal, Learn, Teach lesson, but about how, what the resolution actually is not making what happened before fine, not letting that person totally off the hook and pretending that it was, that it doesn't matter, but recognizing the lessons, gifts, soul growth, awareness that came out of that pain, as comes out of all pain. And I think that's a little controversial and super important to me, as I know it is to you. But that's a controversial part of this course too, because people get really pissed when you say, that sexual abuse can be a gift. Like, who the hell are you? So talk about that.
Well, I'll never forget this moment that I had. It was one of my very first workshops I ever did in my career. So I was super young, not really understanding reactions that I would be getting from the audience. I was talking about that, specifically about why on a higher level we would opt into an experience like that. And I remember this woman just standing up and just starting to scream from the audience. Like, who the fuck are you to say this to me? How dare you say I had anything to do with this? So we get into these types of triggers, and I worry on both sides, actually. I worry that in the spiritual community, we tend to force people there prematurely to see the gift before they've gotten through those.
And then we bypass the pain.
Yep. And I worry to the opposite side, that we demonize the whole experience without really seeing why we might have chosen that. And that prevents us actually from another layer of resolution. But it's all about timing. And you'll notice that as a theme throughout this course, we kept coming back to the fact that timing was such an important and critical part of when you're doing each step and when you're really ready for it and when it's bypassing and when it's actually re-traumatizing and damaging to you to do that step and when it's not.
Yeah, and we show you that and kind of demonstrate that in vivo, which I think is so cool.
Yeah.
And so important because it's really, people get really defensive. It's not to say that it was your fault or that it wasn't something traumatic or horrific, but, I talk a lot about the AFGE, another frickin' growth experience. These kahuna of painful things that happen to us are really entry points for a raise in consciousness, a raise in soul, soul growth, work in the world. That is the ultimate resolution. When you can take that pain and transmute it. You're not transforming it. You're going through it. You can't go over it, under it, or around it. You're going through it, but you're transmuting it to something really beautiful, which I think to me is the ultimate healing.
Oh yeah, totally. Also, we've got a question that people are asking, which is, do you think that this course is going to be just as helpful for men as for women? My answer is going to be yes. Now, the reason that we chose to work with 2 women is because it's harder to find a man who's willing, honestly, to talk about the fact that they've been sexually abused. This is sad. It means that we tend to see this as a isolated to female thing. And if you are a man who's been sexually abused, the attitude we have is sort of like, well, you should be glad about it.
Right. Or you're lucky. Oh, you lost your virginity at 10 to your mother's best friend. Ha ha, aren't you lucky? You know?
Exactly.
And that is even harder because society isn't supporting your pain.
Yeah.
But the statistics show actually that 30% of men have had those are the ones that report it, have had some kind of sexual trauma or abuse. I think the other reason that guys don't come forward, which really breaks my heart, is because they fear, and it's not really unreasonable, they fear that they are going to be caught, like people are going to be scared of them, because there's this misinformation that if you're a male who got sexually abused as a child, you're going to be a pedophile. And that is not true. It is true that almost every pedophile has been sexually abused as a child, but it is by no means true that every man or every woman that has been sexually abused as a child becomes a pedophile. Absolutely not. But I notice that a lot of men actually fear that story in people.
Oh, yeah. Well, we didn't get into the circumcision thing, but that was something I wish we would have touched on, the fact that, like, I mean, there's sex abuse from the get-go with men.
Wow. Yeah, we didn't get into that.
No, we didn't. But I'm also, not only I think will this course be good for men also, but I think it'll be really, really important for men who are in a relationship with women who have been sexually abused.
Yeah. And that, I think that when we were making this course, I was hoping that it was for men and women, and I want men, but in my mind, I was thinking I want every partner of every woman, I want partners to buy it for their loved ones who have been, and I want them to watch it with them. Because that can be one of the hardest parts is, as the partner of someone, there's so few resources for them, and it's so confusing, and they don't understand the anger, and they don't understand why when I have a beard and I want to have sex with you, do you freak out? And they take it personally, or they take the lack of desire personally, or they don't know how to be supportive.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And so I think this is a great course for partners of abuse victims to watch too, for sure.
Yes, totally. So should we take some questions that people have?
Yeah, take some questions. Matthias was telling me to do something, but I don't know what it was. What was Matthias telling me to do?
Matthias, what were you telling Laura to do? She was asking.
I'm being very professional here.
The space between the head and the top is too much.
Ignore.
I don't know. Nobody knows.
All right. So take some questions then.
Okay, so do we have a question? Does the team? Okay, well, why don't you hit us with a good one?
Okay. What role does forgiveness play in sex abuse?
All right, the first question is, what role does forgiveness play in healing from sex abuse?
You want me to answer? No, you answer.
I wish that people would take the concept of forgiveness and throw it as far out the window as they could possibly throw it. That's what I wish. Because forgiveness is not something that people understand. Forgiveness is not something that's chosen. It's the result of prior steps. It's when there's no longer anything to forgive, when there's no longer residual information or emotional charge around the whole situation.
And I think, it is true that when you are stuck often, and I don't think this applies so much to sexual abuse or trauma, but when you are stuck in that place of anger and resentment where you can't let go of something, it is harming you, sometimes even more than the person you're mad at. But in this case, I think you're absolutely right that we rush too quickly to an expectation of forgiveness. And, Oprah used to talk about forgiveness a lot on her show in terms of her sexual abuse history and the shows we did together on sexual abuse. And she would always say that forgiveness is acceptance that you can't change the past, which I think is partially true, but I think it's so much more than that. And I know you and I have talked about this. I know that on a certain level, maybe you wouldn't use that word, but you are at peace, if not forgiven your abuser.
Well,
right?
How do you think I know how to teach about forgiveness?
Right.
Like, you can only teach about forgiveness when you're actually there.
Right. But
And
I
like-
think that's important to say, because we can't just, you say throw it out the window, but you do get to forgiveness once you have reached healing and once you have reached peace and clarity and resolution, then forgiveness is natural.
Yeah, but you can't just decide to do it. This is what frustrates me. You can't just wake up and be like, I'm letting go.
Yes. If only we could. Wouldn't that be nice if we could do that?
Yeah, but it's BS, and I'm really tired of this parade of people, especially in the spiritual field. A parade of people who have attributed forgiveness to I'm a good person.
Right.
And so they bypass everything, the whole healing process.
And they're re-traumatizing themselves.
Totally.
Because you're literally saying to that little girl or little boy in you, screw you. Like, you're just not important enough for me to honor, be with, listen, go through this with. Just get over it.
Yeah.
That's what you're trying to force them to do, which those parts of you just won't do.
Yes. So the role of forgiveness in sexual abuse is throw it out the window. I don't want you to be focusing on forgiveness. Understand that it is the result of prior steps. All you need to do with sexual abuse or any type of trauma that you're trying to overcome is figure out what is stuck, what is not resolved around you, what is making it so you can't move forward, and to create some resolve with that.
Yeah.
Now, we spell out very clearly how to go about doing that, so you don't need to worry about knowing the answer to that. But it should be that forgiveness is the result of healing. It's not.
It's a byproduct.
Yeah.
Can I give you an example that just came up for me recently before my dad died?
Yeah.
So my dad and I had a very complicated relationship. I get into it some in the course, but in this example, he had many infidelities, and when I was growing up, and I was way too in the middle of it in my young little self. And he would tell me that he was cheating on my mom before he told my mom that I was their marriage therapist. It was just so toxic. And I remember when I was 18, he was having this really horrible affair, and he kept stopping it and starting it and stopping it and starting it. And I finally went to him with my little 18-year-old self. And I said, Dad, if you don't stop screwing around with this woman, I am never speaking to you again. And he didn't stop. And it was devastating my mother. It totally devastated me. And so as I was talking to him before he died, I was like, you often say that I'm part of the reason you became a sex therapist, which is true, but not really for the reasons you think. And he's like, what do you mean? I said, well, I really needed to understand how sex could have such a hold over someone that a father would be willing to abandon his daughter over it, that, abandon his life. And I left my childhood thinking that all men cheat. So I married a cheater, that men can't be trusted, so I never trusted, that I'm not really worthy of love because I wasn't worthy enough to you to be more important than your sexual needs. And that is what started me on my journey, and I needed to understand why. And he said, well, did you learn why? And I told him why, which I can't take too much time, but I told him what I learned. And then I told him why I thought my soul chose him. And I told him that I had and if this hadn't happened, then this wouldn't happen, and this wouldn't happen, and I wouldn't have my son, and I wouldn't have this career where I get to help all these people, and so thank you. I forgive you, and thank you for participating with me and traumatizing me enough so that I could reach this point. And for the first time in my entire life, this man said, I am terribly, terribly, terribly sorry.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's I haven't even heard that story yet.
I know. I haven't had a chance to tell you.
Wow. Yeah.
Because he just recently passed away, for those who don't know. But that was a big, big, big kahuna of a thing, that conversation.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which, passing away is also something that tends to trigger sex abuse memories. We should mention that. Because there are points in a person's lifetime where if they have had sexual abuse and maybe they don't have conscious access to it, there are triggers. having a child for the first time, having
Oh, yeah,
that child,
that's a big one.
having the child reach an age at which you started to have
Yes.
abuse happen is one of them. And
Yes.
also death of perpetrators or people involved in the whole thing as well. So,
Yes.
because sometimes I should say this, like sometimes what happens when you've got a big enough perpetrator in the family is when they die, suddenly the being registers, oh, it's safe to fix this now. I don't need to stay fragmented anymore.
Yeah, I think that's true. And the other thing that I'm feeling on my dad's side, which is weird because I keep getting these communications, well, it's not really weird, it makes sense, but that he totally gets it now.
Yeah.
In a way, like he absolutely was incapable of getting, like any traumatizer, you know, who's not healed. So that is another opportunity for healing.
Oh yeah, big time. So we've got somebody who's asking, what about those people who don't recall being abused? Could they come to release the trauma? I'll kick it over to Laura in a minute. I've got 2 answers for this.
Yeah.
The first thing that has to be understood is that you can do a lot of somatic healing and somatic type therapies without having any like conscious, let's call it visual memories, which is what people are really looking for. So somatic therapy is one direction you can really go with that. That's awesome. I also have a process myself. It's called the completion process. You don't have to have actual visual memories, yet again, of what happened. You're getting triggered. I mean, if you have any indication that you might have sexual abuse, it means that you've got some sort of emotional trigger going on.
Yeah.
And what this process does specifically is to use that emotional trigger as the way to go back to recover those memories. And
yeah,
so
it's a great process. I got trained in it in the completion process. I use it a lot now in my work, and I love it. To me, it's like a unique blend of inner child work, visioning, slight somatic.
Yep.
It's like everything combined. It's really cool. But yeah, and I think it's also, you know, along the lines of not knowing, right? Like how, if I, you know, can I heal if I don't remember? You know, let's just talk for a minute about the signs that you might have a sexual trauma history, right? That you don't remember. And usually it's like we were talking about, you find that it's really hard to stay in your body during sexual encounters or even sexual interest from someone. So you'll lose time or you'll go somewhere else in a fantasy land. And that's really in large part what we do. It's such a brilliant way that our minds handle the trauma when we're little. We can't possibly stay and be there because it's so horrific. So we go somewhere else and then we're back when it ends, right? So if you notice you're losing time during sexual encounters, or you're not really in your body, or you get really anxious during sexual content or conversations, or you feel really, really scared, or you have random flashbacks that don't really make sense, what else would you add?
Oh man. Oh God, there's a list 50 miles long. I don't know. The problem is I hesitate sort of giving some of these because they can apply to other things as well.
Absolutely.
You know?
That's true.
Like it's around like the shame-based personality constructs and yeah.
But all of those are forms of sexual trauma too, if it's coming out sexually, right? Like if you were someone who was really shamed, you were caught masturbating, let's say, and you were told you're going to hell and your hand's going to grow hair and you're evil, you know, or like that is a form of sexual trauma.
Yeah, let's go deeper with that because that's something I think most people don't get. And you kind of touched on in the beginning, but we need to go back there because when you say sexual trauma, most people have in their head rape.
Yeah.
Or like, you know, a little kid getting touched or something like that. But sexual trauma, we got to take such a wider look at this.
Yeah.
It is sexual trauma to grow up in a Christian household where you've got somebody constantly telling you that, like, if you diddle yourself, the demons are going to get in.
Right. And that you are wrong, bad, dirty for having any sexual thoughts or needs. Or, you know, I hear, or, you know, your hand was slapped away when you were 3 years old and just exploring yourself and soothing yourself to sleep. Or it could be the opposite, that you grew up in a really over-sexualized environment, you know, where you were being exposed to sexual images at too young of an age or objectified sexually. It could be that you were, I mean, I had a client not long ago and she grew up in a house like you were describing where there's a lot of shame and guilt around sex. And then the first time she had sex, she was in college and she knew she was sinning, right? That was her story. And then right after, she got a call from her mother that her father had gotten in a car accident. And then for the rest of her life, she was convinced that her having premarital sex was the sin that caused her father to die, right? Like, it's amazing. And even though she intellectually knew that was crazy, you know, she was an educated woman, there was that part of her that really believed that. And so there are so many nuances to sexual trauma.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And it can be so subtle, but I think pretty much everyone, certainly if you're a woman, pretty much everyone has had a little bit of sexual trauma, and a huge proportion of men as well.
Yep. I think it's about time in society for us to stop creating this kind of trauma, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, we got a good question that I think would be really nice because of your clinical background and my spiritual background. We're going to have two different angles on this one, but coming towards the center. The question is the child's sexuality developed mostly based on outside influence like parents? I'm going to give my spiritual twist, and then you can take us into the scientific realm of sexuality. Yeah? Okay, so from a universal perspective, sexuality is about manifestation. It's about creation. So most of our sexuality is developed based off of needs and based off of desires. This is where you start to see people forming preferences, things like fetishes.
Mm-hmm.
It's based off of what experience we want to create. I remember talking to a girl a while ago who she developed the sexual interest when she was very, very young in like domination sex, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we take ourselves all the way back to her childhood, which is when the first signs of this type of sexual interest started developing, she was incredibly powerless. I mean, you've got a girl who's so powerless, she's being bossed around like crazy, and she has no personal power.
Right.
There is no her.
No agency.
So the idea of like having a whip in her hand and standing on top of a guy with tall boots and everything is the closest that she could get to that feeling of empowerment, and it excited the hell out of her.
Yeah.
So from a purely spiritual level, that's the underlying current of what's going on with physicality and humans and sexuality, is the desire to create. And when it comes to sexual stuff, I notice that the desire of what to create is mostly an emotional experience, some sort of felt-based experience that people are trying to get close to.
A physical manifestation of an emotional experience that's desired. And in fact, there was some really fascinating research that was created in the 70s and 80s when these paraphilias, you know, or these atypical terms were made, like necrophilia, shoe fetishes, what's another one? Erotophilia. You know, there's a million different philias, right? These or preferences that we have, but that the love map, it was based on this theory of the love map, and that we all have a unique love map, which is sort of our template of what turns us on and what we really desire sexually, which does have those emotional and even physical experiential foundations, and that love map is actually pretty cemented by age 7. So, you know, like my husband jokes, but it's really his love map, that I look almost identical to his preschool teacher who he had this huge crush on. And, you know, he was like, had this romantic cathexis to this woman, and I look just like her, right? I mean, that's a silly example, but it's true.
I love that you just said that, because you know how many guys date me and say that they were obsessed with comic book characters like me? Oh, that is funny.
You're their love map.
Yeah.
Right. And, or it could be the little boy who, you know, was being spanked over his mother's lap and got an erection. And now he's got a cue made in his brain between spanking and pleasure, right? Or maybe that happened multiple times in order to be part of his love map. And that's why for many people, trauma can become part of their love map. Or it is a way, it is very common if you've been raped or molested or abused to have fantasies of either being raped, molested, or abused, because that gives you a chance to have some control and power of it because you're acting out the fantasy, or sometimes you're taking on the role of the opposite, right? But if we're talking about sort of non-trauma or your more run-of-the-mill sexual development, which this person may have been asking about, it is a nature and a nurture thing. But the most important thing is the family of origin and the degree of acceptance, openness, permission, boundaries and foundation that the family gives the child is the most important thing. And being the child's primary source of sex education, which is like woefully poorly done in our country. I mean, most people get their sex education from their friends or from porn, which is the worst form of, I mean, it's the most inaccurate form of sex education there is. I was just talking to my son and his 4 guy friends. They're 13. And they ask me questions about sex sometimes, and something about porn came up, and I was sharing with them the new brain research that, because now that porn is so accessible, they're finding that when boys, tends to be more boys, when boys are looking at porn consistently at too young an age, it actually changes their brain chemistry where they have a harder time getting aroused in a real sexual scenario later. It's like they're setting their love map for porn. And so I said, you know, look, it's not like it's, you know, we could talk about the fact that, you know, the politics of it and who these women are and the fact that these aren't what real women look like or what turns most women on or what real penises look like or anything else. The main thing is that you have to not just depend on that. You have to regularly use fantasy when you're self-stimulating. And these 13-year-old boys looked at like, fantasy, what are you talking about? And I said, you know, your imagination. And they're like, huh? Like had no clue because they had just been counting on porn for their fantasy. And so I had to describe, you know, you see something you like or a girl that you think is pretty or maybe even something you saw in the porn, and then you imagine it. Without looking at something, you're imagining it. That's using another part of your brain to get aroused. And they're like, oh, but they had no idea what fantasy was. So we can't leave that stuff out when we're educating our kids. Sorry, I got on my soapbox, but it's important.
No, that should be a soapbox you get onto because it's really sad.
Yeah.
I also, it's like, you know, it's really normal. Something we got to understand too is like sexual exploration is normal. And that's something that even me with my own son recently have run into, just how overreactive parents are. You know, the fact that children, there are some telltale signs that children are getting sexually abused, you know, and those are pretty easy to watch. And a lot of them are around reenactment.
Yes.
Right.
And we're not talking about like, you show me yours, I'll show you mine in the bathtub. Like they're reenacting sexual acts.
Exactly. But that you show me yours, I show you mine thing is perfectly normal. And so as a society, we can't get blown out of proportion here and realize that we're sexual beings and we're born that way before a certain age. And that's
they've been able to show babies masturbating in utero. They use it to self-soothe. It puts them to sleep. It's totally normal. And we get all freaked out when they, you know.
It scares the crap out of people to think about a toddler as a sexual being.
Yeah. But they are not in the way where, you know, not in the way that we are. It's just a physical, self-soothing, self-exploration kind of thing. But we often traumatize kids around that.
Yeah, hugely. Hugely. Do you have another question? Yeah. Blake says, I want to ask one. Okay, what's another question that somebody gave?
I have ovarian cysts. I'm only 21 years old. Do you know what the underlying cause might be or how to help it?
Oh.
An ovarian cyst.
Yeah, we've got a person who's got ovarian cysts. Like,
well, so I think she's asking you, I think, about the metaphysical underlying cause. I mean, I can talk about the physical cause, but I think she's really asking you why an ovarian cyst would manifest.
Ovarian cysts tend to manifest in women who have been sexually abused.
I'm sorry to laugh. It's not funny, but that's why she's asking the question.
Yeah, well, what tends to happen, see, ovulation naturally pulls a female into a state of receptivity. So when the body is releasing that egg and there's this openness, there's a desire to actually receive the energy of the male. And when that whole process has been blocked, then what the body does is it says, no, I'm not letting go of anything that's mine. It's like, I'm not going to give you any more of what I have.
Something back.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, that's interesting because there was some new research that was fascinating me that girls who they did this research where somehow they were looking at women who grew up in households where they were being sexually abused or in households where they had a stepfather and not a biological father. And they actually, the ones without the biological father often start ovulating more earlier. Now, that doesn't mean that they consciously want that. That's just biology. But it's interesting, given what you're saying, that you would almost do the opposite internally, unconsciously, if you were in trauma. The other thing that I want to mention is, and this is my anecdotal experience working with hundreds and hundreds of women like this for over 25 years, and I'm curious what you'll say, I think you're going to agree with me, is that almost always when you see a young girl cutting, there was, we all know there was trauma, but there was sexual trauma.
Yeah, I've never found it to be other than that, but I've never seen cutting happen when that's the only thing that's happening. See, abuse happens in a family system.
Yeah.
And the thing that makes, I mean, there's a lot of ways that a person could cope, because cutting is a coping behavior. There's a lot of ways that people can cope with sexual abuse. Cutting tends to happen when there's an abuser, and so there's a lot of negative emotions happening within the household, and either the abuser themselves or somebody else in the household is got a pattern going where when the person who is the cutter, right, is expressing a negative emotion, that negative emotion is immediately shoved back onto them.
And
so
it's the only release.
Yeah. So it's the way to imagine it emotionally is like when somebody is vomiting, if you picked it up off the floor and stuffed it back down their throat, like there is no reason for you to feel that way. You have no right to feel that way. This is complete and total BS, and it's your fault. So when somebody in the household is doing that, that becomes the way that people release things.
Other than cutting. Yeah. Or sometimes it's because the child is in such a dysfunctional environment or is the parentified child, and they just don't think there's room for their pain or their feeling. There's not the ability to hold it. It's not even that they're being told they're wrong. They just know that they're probably the highest functioning member in the family, and they have to hold it. You know, I think that happens too. But I always say that, you know, I hate saying that, but when parents call me on my show and say, you know, my daughter's cutting, I was like, you know, I always tell them, look into sexual trauma or abuse.
Yeah.
Because it's almost always going hand in hand.
Yep. Totally. Do we have another one?
How do I teach my 4, 6, and 10-year-olds about sexuality? What is appropriate for their ages and for their unique perspectives? How do I explain in a way they will understand?
Okay, that's too much for me to repeat here.
Circles.
Okay, how do I teach my 4, 6, and 10-year-olds about sexuality? What is appropriate for their ages and for their unique perspectives? How do I explain it in a way that they will understand and not feel shame?
Oh, I have a great book for you.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was gonna lead you in. Actually, Laura wrote a book about this, you guys.
Yeah, it's aptly named Talking to Your Kids About Sex. But it actually talks to you about what you should cover at every age. And their sex education starts really at birth, when you're changing their diaper and you're not going, ew, you know, every time you change your diaper, and you're using the correct terms for body parts. Yes.
I want you to lead back into that, but it's something that I think a lot of people would be interested in, because what most people don't know about sexuality is how the whole potty training experience has such an incredible impact on the development of a child's sexuality.
Not only of sex, but of personality.
Of personality and everything, yeah.
Freud talked about the inner retentive nature, not that we subscribe to everything Freud said, who has own issues, but yeah, potty training, how potty stuff is handled, how diaper changing is handled, you know, the baby's playing with themselves while you're changing their diaper. You know, I used to just sit there and wait until my son finished to keep changing, you know, to finish changing him. Like, he'd be like, rah, 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 and I'd wait a few minutes, let him finish, and not finish, but lose interest, and then clean him. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, something that parents don't understand yet, and I don't know whether psychology actually looks at this or not, but when you're interacting with a child, when I'm interacting with a child and they go to the bathroom, it takes them a while to figure out that what is coming out in the toilet is waste. To begin with, they identify with it. It's a part of them. So it can actually be quite traumatizing.
Yeah. And so when you're going, you know, so I had to like train babysitters. When we had babysitters when they were younger, I'd train them not to say that stuff, and to be, you know, just really, and to use the correct terms for their body parts. This is your nose, this is your chin, this is your elbow, this is your penis, right? It's not a wee or a lulu or whatever it is. And so there are those early messages, but at every phase of development, you're covering different things with them. There, I go over conversation starters and things to cover and diagrams and all kinds of stuff. But the idea is that it's not one talk. It's a conversation for life. And you sometimes are having the same saying, almost the same thing 3 different times at 3 different ages in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, let's say, and the child is internalizing it and processing it totally differently because of where they are developmentally. But I think one of the biggest mistakes we make as parents, in an effort to protect our children, because we must teach them about good touch, bad touch, and this is part of the purpose of the education, that your body is your temple. These are your wonderful genitals. No one else should be touching them except mommy or daddy when we're washing you, and only with your permission, and you shouldn't be touching anyone else's. But we also want to continue to incorporate into that what a gift their body is, and what a gorgeous and amazing gift their sexuality is when experienced by themselves or when shared with someone else under the right circumstances and the right context, which every family can kind of set for themselves within reason. But it's a process, I think, more than anything else. And you may not be having, I don't remember how old she said her kids were, 4, 6, and 7. So she may be having a different conversation with the 4-year-old than she's having with the 6 and the 7-year-old.
Yeah. Well, also watch for sexual interest, I think is important, because children will indicate based on their behaviors and the things that they're saying, what their interest is and what their readiness level is. Yep.
If they know you're open, they will ask questions, and then you only answer what they're asking, and then they ask a follow-up and a follow-up and a follow-up. You don't have to tell them everything at 7 years old when they say, how did I get out? Where did babies come from? Right.
Yep.
It's a process.
Well, one of the hardest things I've noticed with my own son is like helping him to understand that not everybody has the same attitude towards sexuality, helping
I've run into that myself.
At a certain age, it's like especially when you're in a society that thinks a certain way, like we were, down in Costa Rica, it's a Catholic community. So obviously the way that nudity is approached and the way that masturbation is approached and all of these things is going to be way different. And they need to understand that, especially in this era of the Me Too movement, right? You need to understand that.
They need to understand that. And my kids needed to understand them, and it didn't really work because they still, unfortunately or fortunately, told their friends way more than their friends' parents wanted them to know. But as I would give them the answer to things, I would say, listen, not all parents are, a lot of parents are kind of hung up on this stuff or have their own issues with it, and they're not ready for their kids to know this, or they don't want their kids to know this. So this isn't something you share with your friends, which didn't always work because they often did share it with their friends. But I figured at least their friends are getting the correct information.
I know, right? Oh, God. Hope you didn't get too many phone calls.
I only got a few. Okay. And that's what I said to them. I'm like, I'm really sorry. I told them to keep it to themselves, but at least your son got the correct information.
Oh, I like it. Oh, gosh. Okay.
That crazy sex therapist mother. No more play dates at her house.
By an older man in a mall.
Wait, sorry, start over.
I got stalked by an older man in a mall. Luckily, I could resolve the situation quickly. Weird thing, I felt aroused when he came close and felt a weird attraction. Why?
Let me see.
That's a long question.
Yeah, all of these are. Okay. So it's somebody who's saying they got stalked by an older man in a mall. Luckily, they could resolve the situation quickly, but the weird thing is they felt aroused when he came close and felt a weird attraction. Why is that? Now, I think this is totally normal. It's totally normal. When it comes to attraction, and by the way, those of you who didn't hear my update this morning, I'm actually releasing, I think it's going to be next Saturday, an entire video based on attraction, human attraction. Attraction implies a wanting. So the question is, what were you wanting in that experience that could be felt through that experience? And you're only going to be able to figure that out when you get out of the shame of it. This is what Laura was saying in the very beginning when she was saying that one of the issues that we get to with sexual abuse is how often the sexual experience, even if it was in the context of abuse, is something that felt pleasurable. So you'll run into a lot of little girls, for example, who, when daddy's touching them, there's a part of them that's terrified and wants to get out of the situation, and a part that wants it to happen again and loves being the center of attention and all those types of different things. So it's about looking
because there's there's tissue being touched there that is full of nerve endings, and there's sexual organs, and
Yes. So it's about relative to the situation you were in the mall. It's looking at what emotional what was the quality of the emotional experience that was happening when I was being stalked? Is it that I was suddenly the priority of somebody's world? Was
Or
it
so
suddenly
desired and desirable?
Yeah.
This person would do anything to get close to me.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty intoxicating, even if you don't want it to happen.
Yes. Also, what I noticed too is that when a lot of girls who have a little bit of a thing going for stalkers, what it is that you're the only two people that exist. A lot of times when you were raised in an environment where it was like there was stuff going on all the time and everything else had the priority, it was like a really busy household. There was never that level of intimacy where somebody locked into you and it was this little bubble around the both of you.
Right.
And that can
all
be
they
created.
cared about was you, focused on you. Yes, it's getting the attention, being desired, being wanted, having someone being able to move, or being willing at least to move heaven and earth, even in the sickest and most toxic way. Intellectually you don't want that, but it's natural to feel a pull toward that. And I think you're absolutely right. The place where we lose the potential for healing, growth, and clarity is when we say, oh, I'm a sicko for thinking that. Like, I'm not even going to go there, right? You have to get really curious and go into it to get underneath what the longing or the need or the want or the pain is that was informing the reaction that didn't make sense to you. I mean, I think that's true with everything, but nothing more than sex, which is so important for us.
Oh, completely. And then once you do that, you can find conscious ways to meet that need.
Yeah.
Which involve, smarter options than being in a relationship with a stalker. Yeah, but it's really important to not be ashamed of any of your fetishes. I'm really big on this. I talk about some of the most intense fetishes for this reason specifically. It's the shaming around the whole thing, even pedophilia, if you want my honest opinion, that makes it so that people can't ever find the missing experience they're needing and also can't find healing around the experience. And that actually just makes it worse. When it comes to sexual attraction.
I agree. And one of the best experiences I had in my clinical training was I went and worked with a group of sex offenders. And it was so difficult because obviously there was so much judgment and so much, like I had so many feelings about it. And that was the purpose, is I really needed to work through those to be able to work with everyone and to get over my own stuff so that I could really be, help in the way that I wanted to help. And what was so healing for me was the empathy that I was able to gain for these guys who had done some of the most heinous acts. But I remember there was this one session where they were writing letters to their victims. And, it was the most heartfelt, painful thing because they were sharing their own stories of abuse and pain. And so I think understanding, and they had so much shame from their own abuse and for what they had been doing, and were so disassociated from their own shame, both being on the receiving end and on the acting end. And it was only through releasing that shame and that they could really heal and stop being pedophiles. So I have, as much as I don't support pedophilia, I don't think shame serves anyone. It's the worst motivator on the planet for your kids, for yourself, for spiritual growth. Shame is the crappiest one out there.
I agree. So we've got an interesting thing I want to throw at you here.
Okay.
We've got somebody in the chats who's super upset at the fact that with such a serious subject, we're laughing and joking so much.
Okay.
So what is your response to that one?
My response is that, first of all, I understand that if you're deep in the trauma and you're in a lot of pain, it feels disrespectful or like we're not meeting you if we're laughing, right? And when you're going through a lot of pain, whether it's grief or shame or guilt or trauma, you feel so isolated and alone, and you feel like the whole world is going on without you, and you feel angry about that and alone. And so I totally get why seeing us talking about it and also joking around makes you feel even more alone. But I think the reason that we can is because we can see all, and we both have experienced all the sides of this, both personally and as healers. And we have been in the belly of the beast ourselves. We've been in the belly of the beast with countless other people, and we have experienced ourselves and guided others to coming through it to the light. So I think part of, so I understand, and I also think it's important to understand where we're coming from, and that the laughter is not meant to be disrespectful or minimizing the trauma, but is just a reflection of where we are, and a demonstration really of where everyone can be.
Exactly.
You have to add up to that, my love.
Well, I think part of healing, you're not going to be there in the very, very beginning, but part of healing sexual trauma is getting to a place where it is lighthearted.
Yeah.
And that's something that I feel like most people who have been sexually traumatized, they don't have any access to that yet. You know, all of sexuality and all of the topic is just pain.
Yeah.
Right. So
that is a normal phase of healing.
Yeah. So that comment is more of an indication that the person making that comment needs mirroring.
Yeah.
And hasn't been getting it.
Yeah. And hasn't been getting the support they need. And in this course, while there is some laughter, there are a lot of tears and a lot of pain being shown to you, not just ours as we share our stories, but as we work with Corinna and Sylvia, you see how seriously we take the pain. Mm-hmm. And I think you'll find a mirror there as well, and a community.
Yes, I agree. Do you have another one? Okay, they're saying that it's time for us to cut it up. No, I want to answer one more. I'm calling it. Okay?
Oh, she's rebelling.
My girlfriend and I have been together for 3 years. We both have.
Wait, just hand it to me. These questions are long.
Number 3. It says I wrote 3.
My girlfriend and I have been together for 3 years. We both have a history of abuse. We're scared to have sex, even though we want to. What are some good first steps to take to sexual relationship? Okay.
That's a good one. Well, we get to that, actually. We go into that in detail in the course. It was one of the most important parts, I think, to both of us, of how to kind of rebuild your sexuality. But in my, from a clinical standpoint, in addition to all of the spiritual and emotional work, just practically, you're moving super duper slow. And especially when you have 2 trauma victims, you're going to have different thresholds. So the key is in getting really, really clear what the lowest hanging fruit is, what the least traumatizing kind of physical intimacy you can enjoy together is in a safe way, and start there. Maybe it's just cuddling. Maybe it's just caressing each other. Maybe it's just kissing. Maybe it's just touching each other's face and tolerating that and looking into each other's eyes. But slowly moving yourself through the process of adding on the least difficult kind of physically intimate contact from just, I've had people where it's everything they can do to sit across from a partner, look in their eyes, and have their face caressed. And just be with that and stay in their body through that. And that is to be celebrated when they can get there. And then it's to do that on their shoulder or on their body or on their hair or whatever. And then maybe it's doing that with one of you naked. Maybe it's doing that with your shirt off, but you go as slow as you need to. And the key is just not to throw it out with the bathwater and not try and not do it, and to get the support you need. Super, super important. What would you add, my love?
Well, I kind of feel like calling them out a little bit, because honestly, the frequency around this whole question is not that they want to. So
really? Read the question again. Let's see.
It's my girlfriend and I have been together for 3 years. I recognize that's a long time. We both have a history of abuse. We're scared to have sex, even though we want to. But that's not the energy on that question. The energy is we don't really want to. So I would say that the most important thing is to have an interaction with the parts of you that don't want to, and see what those things. Yeah, that's the other thing. Both Laura and I are going to tell you that if a couple decides that what's right for them is to not go towards sex, neither of us are going to say that's a horrible thing to do.
I think sometimes you have to do that so that pressure coming at you can release, and then you can see what you really want. So fine, don't have sex. You don't have to have sex. So what do you want to do to connect?
Yeah. Also, when you actually look at those parts of you and what they're saying about why you don't want to, right? you'll start to see where the doorways are for the opening towards sexuality. For example, if one says, I don't want to because I'm ashamed of my body, now you know that what it takes to resolve the sexual experience is resolution around your feelings towards your own body.
Yeah.
So it's like doing that's going to give you the next step of resolution that needs to happen in order for there to be a sexual relationship. It's not something that I would like to put on the table here is from at least a spiritual perspective. I don't know how you feel about this one, Laura. We didn't talk about this, but from a spiritual perspective, sexuality is natural and it's innate. And so it's not about working on your sexuality or getting good sexually. Rather, it's about taking away the blockages that are preventing you from the natural expression of that sexual energy.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It is our birthright. We are born sexual beings. We are born beings that experience pleasure and aliveness and joy through our bodies and know how to share that with someone else. And the key is not only, yes, removing the blocks to that, and then it happens naturally, but part of the block removing is the context.
Yes.
And that means the person you're with, the circumstances you're in, the boundaries you're holding for yourself, healthy ones, which can sometimes
But Laura, if I'm totally healthy sexually, I should be able to do it with whoever I want to, whenever.
Don't get me started. That makes me so, that makes me so mad. Like, I think women are doing this to themselves, especially I see it most prevalently in the under 40 women who are like, I'm a modern woman. I'm going to have sex with whoever I want. And that's true. You can have sex with whoever you want, but you are taking that energy in. Are you really doing it from a place of power and clarity and boundaries and want from your higher self, or are you doing it from a traumatized place? Because what I see happening time and time again is in their effort to be free, women are re-traumatizing themselves again and again and again.
Completely. Also, if any of you haven't seen, there's this documentary that was just released, I think 2 years ago or something. It's called Liberated. It was one of the most incredible documentaries I've ever seen.
Was that the one that we both watched in spring break? Oh, that was a really good one. That will show you exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was so sad.
Oh, and we also have to talk about the sexual healing kits, speaking of multiple partners or trauma partners or that kind of thing, because we didn't even really get into, which we talk about in the course, kind of the energetic hangover from sex. For men and women, but especially for women, because you're taking that energy if you're having intercourse inside, right?
Oh, and you want this? You want this to scare the crap out of you?
Yeah.
A single sperm contains all of the genetic memories from a man. That's something that your body's absorbing.
Millions and millions of them in one teaspoon of ejaculate.
Yeah. So let's say that one of those gets into your, the walls of your vaginal canal. You're absorbing all of his memory.
Yeah. Oh, on an energetic level. So I started using what we now call the sexual healing kit, which involves a rose quartz wand, because that absorbs a lot. And actually in the course, we show how to use this, and a guided meditation. And that's going to be available as part of the sexual healing course too, because it's not only, spirit and mind, it's also body and taking the power back there as well.
Oh yeah, but that's such an important part. I don't know why that wasn't on the thing, but we did a whole section, didn't we, about like the physical element of sexual trauma and how important self-care is. And we tend to think of sex also, I think that you're the one touching on this, that sex is always about penetration, when sex is like that's not the case. Like sex is such a wider type of a pleasuring, self-pleasuring type of experience. And that's obviously if you've had trauma around sexuality, where especially those of us where a lot of that trauma was not pleasurable at all.
Yeah.
But getting back in touch with what pleasure even is for your body is like, what the hell?
Sensual awareness and self-pleasure and learning your own body on your own terms. As the person you are now, I think is so important. We go over that in the course for sure, because I remember talking a lot with our women about that. Oh, and
it's so important. For both men and women, because if you've got entire cultures that believe that sexuality shouldn't really be about pleasure, you've got issues on both sides of the boat. But also we've got a whole, how recent has it been that we have even had a conversation around pleasure and women and sex?
No, we haven't. mean, even the sexual revolution in the 60s, if you look at it, it really wasn't about pleasure.
No.
It was about permission, which is something. That's a start, but it wasn't about pleasure. And what I find is in those women who are having lots of sex with lots of different people, the assumption is that they're swinging from the chandeliers with orgasms, but they're not having orgasms at all most of the time. I don't mean to generalize.
No, it's true. No, I've actually found this too. Like the women who you'd consider, oh yeah, by the way, I'll just go into this because it'll be interesting for people before we get off. Sexual trauma tends to split people, and they tend to identify either with the part of themselves that is hyposexualized or hypersexualized.
Right.
So it's very,
yes.
No. So the slut type, which is the hypersexual person, it's a tendency for people to look at that and think that there's sexual pleasure happening there. And I'm totally on board with what Laura's saying, that the majority of the women you talk to that are on that edge of the category, the opposite is the case. No. They're not having orgasms. They have used this. It's almost like they've taken power by taking control of the sexual experience. Yeah. So even them, I mean, even they have to come into alignment with what does pleasure and sexuality mean for me specifically.
Or how can I just even stay in my body while I experience sensual awareness?
Yeah.
That might be the start.
Which begins with us.
Yes.
So we go into that in the course. That's why you were touching on the rose quartz wand and your whole, sexual pact thing. Because it really starts with you touching yourself. And then we start to graduate it.
Yes. First you have sex with the most important person you love, yourself. And then,
but we do also touch on self-love, which is an issue for people who have been sexually traumatized.
That's super important. It's super important for all of us. But because as we know, the love we have to give starts with the love we have for ourselves.
Okay, you guys, so an hour is more than up because I decided to stay longer. Big surprise. Nothing like me. But yes, this is us basically saying, hi world, we have released our sexual healing course today. For anybody who's experienced sexual trauma or who knows somebody who has, this is a good course. I'm biased.
And us.
But I'm also picky. So if I say this is a good course, it's a good course. And believe me, I would know. Why? Because I'm a survivor. And I know that there's nothing out there that exists that's good enough.
Yeah. Now there is.
Now there is. Yeah. So what I'm open to doing too is, I mean, you guys seem very interested in this. So Laura and I may potentially be doing another one of these talks if you guys love it a ton. Yeah. Because I've enjoyed this. And I think I can tell the hunger that people have for this. And the confusion. People are hungry and confused.
I love you to pieces. I'll play with you around this and work with you around this any day.
Me too. Okay, love you guys. If you want to get this course, go to tealswan.com/sexual healing. We will be advertising it everywhere and making it very easy for you to find because I know better than anyone how difficult it is to navigate the world of the internet. And besides that, I hope you guys have a really good day, and I hope this course helps you guys a bunch. We'd love to hear your feedback. Love you. Love you, Laura.
Love you.